Hello dear students. Last class, I've just introduced you Roland Barthes. So in this class also, we are continuing with the discussion of Roland Barthes and his concepts readerly text, writerly text, denotative meaning, connotative meaning, and his 5 different codes when he was uncovering the details of narrative and so on. Semiotic theory is there in our life too. The interpretation of signs, what we see all around is a sign. It is the part of semiotic theory, but we are not realizing it. Let's get into the slides and learn more about semiotics and signs. Semiotics. It's a study of signs. It's a study of the way signs behave within society. Signs can be anything, gestures or symbols or language. Signs operate within various systems of communication between people. See, for example, in a traffic signal, we have red light, green, and yellow, and these are different way to communicate with people. That red indicates to stop, or in the roadside you can see the signals of danger. That is another sign, and it carries a meaning. So Shaw's theory is organized around two sets of binary opposition. One is language and speech, we have seen that, and the next set of binary opposition is that signifier and signified. The importance of signs and signification has been recognized throughout much of the history. It was being recognized in philosophy and also psychology. Plato and Aristotle both explored the relationship between science and the world. And in the recent times, Umberto Eco, a theorist, he in his work Semiotics and Philosophy of Language, he argued that semiotic theories are there in almost all the major thinkers. Semiotic theories, the study of science and how that science conveys meaning, all those things are there, or about science are there in almost all the major thinkers. Saussure argues that language is just one of the systems of science that enable human beings to communicate, but we can say it is the most important system of science that enable human beings to communicate with one another. And there are other ways to communicate. There are other signs also in other systems to communicate with people. For example, certain rituals in temple, or certain social conventions, or sign language, or whatever it is. See, when we see we can see women are almost associated with kitchen, or in all the houses women would be doing the kitchen works and all. So there, that is a sign, and it communicates something to the society. Or we can say in the temples, there are rituals happening, and it communicates. Each ritual carries one or another meaning. In the church also, mass are there. In the mass, there when the priest is chanting his prayers, that has some or other meaning in that, and it also carries a message or meaning. It communicates to the people. All sign systems are essentially arbitrary, and he's saying that there is no rational connection between a physical object, that is the signified, and the word or symbol attributed to it. There is no rational connection. The green light, for example, you can think about the traffic light. Green light in the traffic a signal point where it is associated with the action go, you can move on. But it can also be the other colors, purple or blue color, and there is nothing inherent about the color green, and there is no connection between the color green and the action to go. And green, it is not conveying anything like it is an appropriate symbol to indicate that it is safe to move ahead. It is not like that. We have given the action of go with that color green. Roland Barthes further develops the theory of the arbitrary nature of science, and his works include Writing Degree Zero, Mythologies that we have seen, Criticism and Truth, as far as the Pleasure of the Text, Image, Music, Text. And according to Barthes, the emphasis is on interdisciplinarity in literary and cultural analysis, the relationship between literature and culture, literary and cultural analysis has changed the conception of language and the notion of the literary work. Earlier, people had a notion of literary work that it stands alone, it is in a particular genre, it stands alone, and the interdisciplinary approach altered this conception. And the work, a particular work, has changed, and a new object has been has arrived. That is the text. Text has appeared instead of work. This he mentions in his work, From Work to Text. And just keep this in mind, from work to text. This is his work that shows his leap towards structuralism, because work is just collapsed by the rise of text. It is a leap to structuralism as work is collapsed by the rise of text. Okay, and he is moving towards deconstruction. So we are not going deep into that. And just keep in mind that Barthes distinguishes the text from the work on the basis of other propositions, method which it is analyzed, genre in which the text is there. It is not, he's not supporting that, and science and the plurality of meaning, reading, filiation, pleasure, and so on. While Barthes' theory of the text and the work is primarily applied to written texts like poem, drama, novel, and but it is not restricted to this medium alone. Meaning and value occur in other cultural forms too. What can be the other cultural forms? Music, photography, painting, film, cultural events. Music has a meaning, photography has a meaning, painting has a meaning, film has a meaning, cultural events have a meaning, has a meaning. So every things, all these cultural forms carries a meaning, and Barthes theory can be applied to these things too. And now we are going to talk about readerly text, which we have already seen. Readerly text he explained in S bar Z. Barthes argues that most texts are readerly text. Why it is said that readerly text? Because meaning is clear in that. It is familiar, it moves in a linear manner, or traditional way of writing, and meaning is clear in that, meaning is fixed in that, meaning is also predetermined by the author. Reader's role is just to receive the information. Reader just doesn't have to decode anything in that. Reader, the meaning is clear to the reader, and these texts attempt through the use of standard representations and dominant signifying practices. In the work, in the readerly text, you can see the dominant signifying practices. For example, if you take the example of early previous movies, it contains a meaning that, almost in all the movies it shows that women should be there associated with the kitchen only, and women should be submissive to their husbands, like that. It was the dominant practice, and also in movies also it was showcased like that. It signifies something, it was a sign. Okay, and it was a signifier, showcasing a woman like that. It was a signifier, and it hide any elements that would open up to the text to multiple meaning, and it was meaning was inherent in that. There was no plurality of meaning also. But if we take the example of writerly text, a text readerly text can also be analyzed in the form of writerly text. Writerly text reveal those elements that the readerly attempts to conceal. Readerly text that it is covers certain ideas, but writerly text reveal those elements. Reader is in a position to control the meaning, or the reader got an active role in the construction of meaning. Reader construct the meaning. The stable meaning or meta-narratives of readerly text is replaced by a lot of meanings. In the writerly text, reader can produce meaning, so there would be proliferation of meanings, multiple meanings would be there, and disregard of narrative structure. There is a multiplicity of cultural and other ideological indicators, or you can take several cultural meanings out of it, or you can just take other ideological codes from it. And reader shows reader takes all these things from the text. Reader approaches the text from an external position of subjectivity, and there is no position of author there. By turning the reader into the writer, writerly texts defy the commercialization and commodification of literature. Reader is the producer of the meaning, writer is no more there. Reader is the producer of meaning, reader gives meaning to the work. To interpret a text is not to give it a meaning, but on the contrary, to appreciate what plural constitutes it. He says in S. Barizet, to interpret a text is that it is not giving a correct meaning to that, but to appreciate what plural meanings can be there in it. And reading the plural text, according to Barthes, there is always more than one way to read a text. Within any given text, any given poem or novel, there is a plurality of meaning rather than one correct reading. There can be more than one meaning. Uncovering a text plural meaning requires not only reading but also rereading. When we read a work, we may get a denotative meaning, but when we go deeper and deeper, we get connotative meanings. Every time you read a text, you read it in a slightly different way. With each rereading, another meaning comes to the surface. We are familiar with there being more than one plot line in a text. Barthes' threads, however, are found at the semiotic rather than the narrative level. He moves in the way of signs and how signs give the meaning. His theory of the five codes is a way of grouping signifiers according to the role they play in the text. Now he is going to speak about five codes. Barthes, in his structural analysis of narrative and as Barizet, developed a detailed mode of narrative. He breaks the narrative into its constituent elements, way the Zoshor has divided language. He breaks the narrative into its constituent elements and discover how they combine with each other, how it is related to each other. He read a short story by Balzac, Sarracine, and he identified 561 units of meaning, or what he called lexias, units of meaning. He called it as lexias. He organized the lexias into five main groups, all working in combination in a narrative. And we are going to see what all these five groups are. He called it as codes. These codes are the narrative's mode of organizing the units so that meaning is generated. These codes are common to all narratives. In all the narratives, you can see this codes. Pavaratty code. First one, it is the most visible aspect of a narrative, and it refers to the sequence in which the events of a story unfold. That is the most visible aspect. This happened and then this happened. In a linear way, it moves. And in from this proartic code, you get a meaning, a linear meaning you will be getting. And next one is hermeneutic code. This is the code that informs our interpretation. Like when we hear a story, when we read a story, the questions we ask of the narrative: what happened after that, how does it happen, why, what was the reason for that, like that. This is the code that informs our interpretation, and it gives certain meaning. And next code is the cultural code. That is the code that narratives assume we all share. Cultural codes are those elements of common knowledge that we share as a community. In a community also, we share a common knowledge or common practices, and these elements can also be dissected in the cultural code of a narrative. Next is semic code. This is the code that rose upon, like in the cultural code, a common set of stereotypes that are self-descriptive and self-evident. The stereotypical codes in the works, you can see those stereotypical codes itself is self-descriptive and self-evident, and it carries a meaning. Example, women in the kitchen, you can, it is a stereotype and it is self-descriptive and self-evident. Next is symbolic code. It is also similar to semic code, but it extends beyond the stereotype and it refers something larger. Proartic code encompasses actions or small sequences of the narrative, and that creates narrative tension also, because we anticipate certain events in a narrative, because we know after an event happen another event happen, and there is a linearity. And by telling us that someone had been sleeping, we now anticipate them waking up, and it creates a small structure of narrative tension and expectation. And out of these units, whole narrative has a forward drive. One event happened followed by another will be happening, and this is connected with Barthes' notion of the readerly text. Reader assimilates distinct pieces of information in a prescribed order. Next is semic code. That is, it concerns meaning, but it acts upon the connotative level of meaning. And connotative level of meaning from the resonances, additional linguistic associations with the character or their characters, definite style. From that, we can get another connotative meaning also in relation to character, and it moves beyond the literal denotation of the words. Semicode will thus work to construct an evolving character through the signifiers, like costume, physical appearance, psychological traits, speech, lexis. From these things, we get the connotative level of meaning rather than the denotative level of meaning. In Kumblingi Nights, we have both denotative and connotative levels of meaning, but it has more connotative level of meaning. അതിനൊരു കുഞ്ഞ് എക്സാമ്പിൾ പറയുകയാണെങ്കിൽ, ഇപ്പം മൂവി കൂടുതൽ അസോസിയേറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്, കാരണം നിങ്ങൾ എല്ലാവരും കണ്ടിരിക്കുന്ന, മിക്കവാറും കണ്ടിട്ടുള്ള സിനിമ ആയതുകൊണ്ടാണ് അതിനെക്കുറിച്ച് പറയുന്നത്. ഇപ്പം കുംബ്ലിങ്ങി നൈറ്റ്സിൽ അവസാനം കാണിക്കുന്ന സീക്വൻസിൽ ഫഹദിൻ്റെ ക്യാരക്ടറിനെ സൗബിൻ്റെ ക്യാരക്ടറും ശ്രീനാഥിൻ്റെ ക്യാരക്ടറും കൂടിയിട്ട് പിടിച്ച് കെട്ടുന്ന ഒരു സീനുണ്ട് അല്ലേ. അത് പറയുന്നത് എന്താണ്, അമിതമായിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു പേട്രിയാർക്കൽ ആറ്റിറ്റ്യൂഡ് തന്നെ ഒരു മാഡ്നെസ്സിൻ്റെ പോലെയാണ് അവരത് കാണിക്കുന്നത്. ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് എ കൊണോട്ടേറ്റീവ് ലെവൽ ഓഫ് മീനിങ്. ആ ഒരു പെർട്ടിക്കുലർ ക്യാരക്ടറിനെ മാത്രമല്ല അവരെടുത്ത് കാണിക്കുന്നത്, ബട്ട് ഓൾ ദോസ് പാട്രിയാർക്കൽ ഫിഗേഴ്സ്, അത് മുഴുവനോടെയാണ് അവിടെ കാണിക്കുന്നത്. So that can be taken as a connotative level of meaning. And the characters, costume, name, physical appearance, psychological traits, everything have different connotations. And when we move into symbolic code, the symbolic structure of the text, symbolic code produces a structure of symbolic meanings that accumulate throughout the text to establish a larger structure. These symbolic clusters of meanings might be around binary oppositions, symbolic culture of meaning that is beyond the semic code, and it would function around male female, inside outside, hidden revealed, hot cold, etc. So we have seen his 5 different kinds of semiotic elements that are common to all text, how meanings can be taken. He gathers these signifiers into 5 codes: hermeneutic, proeretic, semantic, symbolic, and cultural. The term codes maybe it is a misleading term, because rather than we can say those are the set of rules for how a text should be interpreted. Barthes codes are a perspective form which you can view a text. You can use any of these codes to analyze a text. Reading a text with the 5 codes in mind is looking at an image through a series of colored lenses. So you'll be getting a lot of impressions. Image remains the same, but your impression keeps on changing. Another way to think of the 5 codes is as a set of voices speaking at the same time. Different voices, 5 different voices speaking at the same time. Barthes advises us to listen to the text as an iridescent exchange carried on by multiple voices of these codes, 5 different codes on 5 different wavelengths. In some texts, there will be 1 or 2 dominant voices. The hermeneutic and proeretic codes dominate what Barthes refers to as classical text. In classical text, you can see hermeneutic and proeretic codes dominate. That is the syntagmatic axis. Often these are texts that have been read and criticized to such an extent that they have an accepted meaning. These texts have been read and criticized, and to an extent, because they have an accepted meaning, it is more or like readerly text. Lectures from these texts must be read in order if the narrative is to make any sense. Barthes would classify many of the poems and novels as we think of as canonical in this group, identifying in the hermeneutic and proeretic codes. Some genres rely more heavily on one code than the others. Mystery novels and all will work on hermeneutic code, because they rely on the reader's desire to learn the answer to the question who done it by the end of story. That hermeneutic code we always question, we are seeking the answers to the questions: who done it, the interpretation, how, why, what, like that interpretive questions are there in hermeneutic code. Elements of both readerly and writerly text can be interpreted through these 5 codes. In order to reveal a text plural meaning, Barthes recommends breaking the text into lexias or units of meaning, then determining which of the codes. Hermeneutic, I talked to you about, that is interpretation. Proeretic, that is a sequence in which the events of a story unfold. And cultural code, that is cultural codes, the common knowledge that we share as a community. For example, I can give you that in a sentence like, during the Raj, things were very different. So when we hear, as Indians, we will understand the term Raj without any glossary or explanation. In the sentence, during the Raj, things were very different. Indians can understand what does it mean, because we all share a common culture or common knowledge we know about this Raj. And we saw about semic code, that is the code draws upon, like cultural code, a common set of stereotypes that are self-descriptive and self-evident. That for example, we can say when we see a man in white clothes and wearing a Gandhi cap, we know he is a politician. The stereotype uh, is in uh, is well in place for all readers, and therefore doesn't require any explanation for that code. And for symbolic code, we already discussed, very similar to the semic code. It extends beyond immediate stereotype and it refers something larger. For example, in a horror film, we get images of darkness, a shot of moon, and in the street, a night in a street, moon you can see, and it got some meaning, right? We are aware of the significance of night in horror films, and when at night is showcasing, we know some evil is going to happen. That is a symbol, and it is a shift from the semic code, which is semic code is that common set of stereotypes which are self-descriptive. That night is descriptive there, and we know something is going to happen. And again, the shift from the night and to the signs of moon and empty streets to the symbolic, because we know something is evil to happen, and because we move beyond ordinary day or night semic code, and from that code we are moving into the notion of good or bad, or some dangerous things are happening, is going to happen. And for night we are giving that meaning, some danger is going to happen or some evil is going to happen. And so we have given the meaning that night to bad in the horror movies, and that is a symbolic code, and how we are getting the meaning out of it. And five codes represent five different ways of seeing meaning in a text. They act as lenses that highlight different aspects of the narrative. In other texts, five voices speak at all once. Turning into each voice, we may hear what the text is trying to tell us. Text in which the semantic, symbolic, and cultural codes dominate in writerly text, because it acts upon the secondary level of meaning, connotative level of meaning, because elements of these codes are connotative rather than denotative, and they do not have to be read in order. And we have seen in the Esbarizad, I already talked to you about the short story Zarasin, and he broke up it into different units of meaning, lexias, and which is examined individually to get more meaning. In Barthes' piece entitled The Photographic Message, Barthes explained his theory about signs contained within images and what they mean in a cultural sense. What do these images mean in a cultural sense? And he's after a structural analysis of photographic message of the journalist image. Barthes believes that a photograph is also a system of signs. That means it has a meaning. Photographs become a code of cultural knowledge and ideas. It is the way in which a society communicates too. Photograph also communicates something. It is also a signifier. It is also a sign. In images, you must understand the cultural biases that come through in that particular image. For Barth's theory of the photographic message, images are made up of two things. There also we get denotation and connotation. Denotation is the literal meaning of a sign as opposed to connotation, which is the implied meaning of a sign. For example, if we get an image of war scene We can see many people are engaging in battle, but there is also connotative meaning to that. What is it? That the themes of suffering, those people are in the battlefield, they are suffering mentally, but also the people associated with them are also suffering. These are all the connotative meaning in that. So a message photographic message also has two types of meaning: a denotative level of meaning and a connotative level of meaning. Next, we are talking about Rectoric of Image. This essay is a classic semiotic text where Barthes analyzes an advertising image. You can see the image, and it as a means of teasing out how different messages are conveyed by a system of signs. The ad he uses is the Panzani ad, within which he finds a rich layers of meanings. So we are going into that. Image used is a Panzani ad, which is reproduced here. He starts by identifying three classes of message within the image. First one is linguistic message. He sees two kinds of linguistic messages at work: a denoted message comprising of the caption and the labels on the produce, and also a connoted message. Denoted message, it is clear from the signs here, and also a connoted message. The word Panzani, because it connotes to Italianicity, because even though it is a French company of for French firm Giovanni Baldo Panzani, the person who came from Italy and he migrated to France, and he started to manufacture fresh pasta there, and it became a firm. So it also connotes to, the word also connotes to Italianicity. And next is symbolic message, that is connoted image. Four signs are then identified from the non-linguistic part of the image, and they constitute the symbolic message or connoted image. The half-open bag signifies return from market. Tomatoes and peppers signify the Italianicity. Collection of objects signifies a total culinary service, right? Things associated with food. Overall composition is reminiscent of, therefore signifies notion of a still life. The literal message or the denoted image, it shows that a tomato stands for tomato only, or a pepper stands for pepper only. So here the signifier and signified remains the same. So, Barthes also believed that every ideological sign is either a connotative sign system or a denotative sign system. A denotative sign, which is descriptive, result of the signifier image and the concept combining. Connotative sign is that it lost its historical meaning, and it gives new meaning from culture or event, like that. And semiotic theory, interpretation of signs, it applied to almost every aspects of our daily life, but we don't realize it in the name of semiotic theory. So that's it for today's session, and we'll continue with the discussion of Barthes in our next class. Happy learning.